The Ask the Experts Theater at CSCMP Edge 24 is sponsored by Knopf.
Welcome. This will be a challenge, this session, and I think of it as the most important session that's going on at this event. We're the only ones talking about returns and reverse logistics, and there's a lot of them, So we'll talk about that. And we are a Q&A session. I'd like to show a couple of slides, and then I'm going to let my panelists introduce themselves. And again, this is all about the returns and the reverse logistics world. And if you don't know the numbers, they are big. I've got them on the screen where it mentions now that e-commerce is maybe 21% of retail sales, that number of returns is going to go up because returns are much higher, as most of you know, in e-commerce. This is a slide. This deck is available if you want it. The importance of this deck is that the reverse logistics is an ecosystem, and we lean towards being a circular industry. Try to bring as much back and do something with it as possible. I'll also show you, if you've not been in a returns facility, and I can tell by the looks on your faces, most of you have not been in a returns facility. You've not seen the way these products look when they come back. You just take it to the returns desk and give it to somebody, get your money, you walk out, and this is what you leave behind. And all of my panelists are very familiar with these pictures. So it's going to be about reducing returns costs, but I'm going to leave this picture up, and we'll talk about some numbers. But right now, I'd like to introduce my panelists. They've come a distance, and I am proud that the Reverse Logistics Association is a global entity. We're the only ones out there. I realized I didn't say my name. So I'm Tony Sciarrotta, and I'm the executive director of the RLA. And we're very simply the association of the retailers and manufacturers who make stuff, sell stuff, and get stuff back that they have to deal with. The other part of the community are the service providers, industry partners who come up with solutions. If you go to rla.org, you can join the community and learn a lot, and your company can even be a member. And with that said, I will tell you I've got an advisory board, and their voices are in my head all the time. I'm not completely schizophrenic, just that I know what they're thinking. And with that said, I'll let Chuck introduce himself.
Good afternoon. Yeah, Chuck Johnston. I serve on the RLA board. Been working in the industry for a number of years. I'm currently the CSO for a 3PL company dealing with total returns management, Return Pro out of Miami. My background is Walmart, Home Depot for over 30 years combined. So, and most of that time was in setting up and managing the reverse network. So with those two companies, have a little bit of experience in the return side of the house.
Thank you, Chuck. Go ahead, Troy.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Troy Campbell. Worked for Home Depot for 29 years, in 13 of those years in the reverse space. So my current role is director of the reverse organization for Home Depot, supporting the really the 4 facilities that we flow all returns back through to our vendors. Been doing this now, so total supply chain, probably close to 30 years, but like I said, 13 years in reverse. Glad to be here.
And Harrison?
Hi, got it? Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Harrison Lloyd. I'm the director of reverse logistics at Bargain Hunt, which is a local company to Nashville. We're headquartered just south of town here in Laverne. We're an extreme discount retailer, so we have 90 brick and mortar retail locations, as well as playing a couple other sales channels in the reverse logistics space. So, in my role, handle our reverse logistics contracts in terms of product acquisition from big box retailers and e-tailers, as well as being a retailer ourselves in the brick and mortar space, obviously handling returns component organically from our stores. So happy to be here.
And Harrison's being a little bit modest here. I do want to point out that the Bargain Hunt stores specialized in liquidation of returns when I was at Phillips. And I got to know them when they had 5 stores, and they're now 91 stores in the Midwest.
Yeah, correct.
Right. So that tells you a little bit about how much that business is growing and how some companies can do well with it. Again, this is a Q&A session. If you've already got questions, go ahead and put up your hand. We'll try to get it. If you don't, I've got some questions prepared for my guests. And again, you're hearing from absolute industry thought leaders here who understand that the last number we reported from the NRF, the National Retail Federation, last year said that returns were $743 billion retail value. That makes it, if you considered that as a country, it would be the 18th largest country in the world just in the returns industry. And by the way, that's only B2C. We're talking about B2C products right now. You start to throw in the B2B world like Cisco and Intel and some of those organizations, and we are a $1 trillion industry. It's enormous, and it's not getting smaller. So with that said, again, I'll pay attention. If you raise your hand, we'll try to get your questions. Most important is there's a lot of pain points in the industry, in the return space. And we don't spend enough, and you're looking at pictures of some of the pain points, right? How do you handle that stuff? And actually, I'd like to start with Troy here from Home Depot, because Troy, they look like this, maybe better when they come in, right, Troy?
Yeah, I like to say those pictures are not from any of my facilities. They do look a little better. But I will tell you, the old adage is, who returns product to any retailer, right? It doesn't come back in a box, right? It comes back with a bag from Walmart to Home Depot, right? Or it comes back in pieces. It comes back, your typical ceiling fan comes out with 3 blades sticking out of the box and 1 blade stuck in it. And we have to flow that through our building. So yeah, typically there's a challenge to flow that. Your productivity is a little bit lower when we have to deal with stuff like that.
And Troy, just to be clear, when you get this stuff back, we've talked about automation of processing, which can't really exist in a return center. Your pain point is every single carton has to have every single piece touched.
Yeah, exactly. And the word "can't's" a tough word. Like, we'd love to get some automation in the reverse field, but we've toyed with that a little bit. And the challenge is that, in the forward distribution sites, those boxes are perfectly square. They get read really well through the conveyors and such. But when you go to the reverse side, like I mentioned earlier, those comes back in bags and pieces, and the boxes are ripped open or torn. The automation does not really read those boxes as well as you would imagine, so it's much more challenging. So we're forced to kind of physically handle each box and put that through basically really more of a manual conveyor system.
And Chuck, if I can come to you about pain points in this process.
Well, the only thing I wanted to add in addition to since we're in a supply chain meeting is, yeah, the NRF data talks about returns being in the 743 billion, but the other side that is prevalent in our industry is those things that are excess and overstock that are not in that number, that are significantly drive that number, potentially, Tony, over $1 trillion. So, I mean, when you think of that and you think about what retail sales are in terms of annualized in these categories, it can be upwards of 25% of what is out there that's got to be managed, other than in a forward standpoint. So and it's becoming more and more challenging, Tony, to your point. 21.6% of current retail sales are e-commerce. And e-commerce are more problematic for companies in terms of just the sheer cost of managing e-commerce sales. But when you look at e-commerce return rates, they're more than double what big box returns are. So now when you look at the numbers for NRF, there's an equal number of e-commerce returns between buy online, return in store, direct from a consumer, as there are in-box returns. And why that's problematic if you're in store operations is generally with the extended aisle, e-commerce returns or e-commerce SKUs can be 20, 100-fold greater than what's in stock in the store. So because there's such a large number coming back to the retail big box stores, it's problematic for them, and how do I handle it? Because I'm not traded for it. I don't have a location for it. It doesn't show up on the Home Depot app.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of those items that Chuck mentioned, like we can't even put those back in stock. So the challenges are they come back into our building, and you would think, hey, that's a regular saw. Why can't I put that back on the shelf? Well, we can't. It's not a stockable item in a lot of our stores, so we have to flow that back through the reverse channel, then back to the vendor. So that is that challenge.
And as we're going to switch over to Harrison in a moment, but again, think about this for a moment. Somewhere north of 90% of product returns have nothing wrong with them. Nothing. They didn't fit, or they didn't like the way the tool worked, or they didn't like the way it looked in the house, and they're sending it back. Nothing wrong with it. So there's an incredible amount of waste in our space. But what we are happy to see are companies like the Bargain Hunt stores. And Harrison, your company is a solutions provider in many ways, right? You want to talk to that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's an interesting component when we're looking at reverse logistics and in the management of this product, as it seems to be commonly thought of as a little bit abstract, right? It's happening somewhere in these varied warehouses, and it's kind of out of sight, out of mind. So bringing it into a brick and mortar, that type of product into a brick and mortar environment, like we do at Bargain Hunt, is a little bit unique. And picking up on some of what Chuck and Troy were talking about, some of the solutions that may make really good sense for traditional e-commerce product or companies lead to some challenges downstream if you're trying to reintroduce that into a brick and mortar environment, things around packaging and things of that nature. So when you're looking at an assorted group of goods like Tony has up on the screen, there's a lot of different things going on there, from identification of the product, grading the product, and then ultimately what sales channels they're going to lend themselves to.
There's a question in the back. You're going to have to...
How are the return center policies changed?
Oh,
I think was the
return
question.
policies. Interesting question, and we'll get to that with a couple of our experts here. I want to point out that I spent 25 years on the manufacturer side with Philips, electronics and other products. And part of the return policy is implemented by a manufacturer, but if you want to sell your products into a retailer, you have to listen to their policy and work with that. And so it's important to discuss return policy. And the fact is, return policies vary. We'll let some other experts talk to it. But from a manufacturer's view, what we see in the environment, in our culture, frankly, is we become a country where we all feel entitled to buy anything we want and return it anytime we want. And there's not a lot of guardrails on that. And that's been done because of e-commerce. But way before e-commerce, by the way, let's just recognize that there was this little company called Sears. And Sears and JCPenney 100 years ago put these things on the store doors that said satisfaction guaranteed. So why wouldn't you or I buy something from there, and if we don't like it, take it back? So we've got a culture issue. But when it comes to policies, I'm going to let Troy speak to that first, and then Chuck.
Yeah, so return policies are really driven when that product is bought and manufactured from the manufacturer. Some of those don't change. They're just old and sitting there for years because they don't want to reopen those policies up. But what has changed as a company, we actually see so much fraud in the return business, especially because e-commerce, right? It's such an easier avenue for fraud to happen. So what we did, we've actually changed our return policies to the consumer to kind of mitigate that fraud aspect. And in the past, like, you may or may not have realized when you bought something, your credit card gets kind of credited right away as soon as you mail that back. Now there's a delay, and that delay is really unfortunately due to the amount of fraud that many retailers see, including Home Depot, and that the way to mitigate that is say, okay, we're going to validate that product is actually in the box when we get it through one of our centers, and that's one of the big things we've changed.
Yeah, and I would add to that, it depends which policies you're talking about. If you're talking the policies of a seller or the retailer in terms of that as it relates to the customer, you are seeing some changes in that, because as companies get more savvy on the cost of managing returns, they're looking for the consumer to participate more and more. And some of the algorithms customers use, they'll just say, look, it is not worth it to return. just keep it. And then they have to have things in place to manage those habitual returners. Now, if you're talking from the OEMs to the retailers, that's seen some significant changes over the years. And the reason, again, everybody's becoming aware of the cost of returns. And as they look at it, and the retailer still wants to maintain the same price points and the same margins, something's got to give. And what you've seen over the last 20 years is where if it was non-import product or if it was a domestic importer, historically, a lot of that went back to the OEMs. If you look at today's environment with most of the retailers, maybe 25, 30% goes back to the OEMs anymore. And a lot of times that's associated with brand protection or whatever it is. But a lot of them are going to allowances because what they're finding is because most of it's non-defective, that additional trip that costs to go back to the OEMs adds no value in the product. So they're pushing it back to the retailers, and now the retailers are having to go to companies like Harrison or others to figure out what's a good outlet for this product, whereas I previously sent it to the OEMs.
And a lot of those OEMs don't have a process to take these back either, so sometimes they're challenged with that as well. So they rather have the retailers who may have something set up to kind of flow that product back.
And a couple more words on return policy, retailer policies. But I did want to have Harrison brought into this because Harrison, it's a little different return rates in the secondary market and policies. Why don't you talk about what is being done at Bargain Hunt on return policies?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, in the secondary market, generally, there isn't return policies for the most part. Most sales are final. We were one of the first to kind of introduce a notion of returns on secondary market product, which was a big deal in the space. But I think generally speaking, when you're talking about returns policies, how they've changed, and kind of the maturity of the kind of the reverse logistics space, it's amazing how much it's matured over the last decade or so, yet still how immature it is, right? When I first started, you talk to, even a moderate sized, retailer about what they did with their returns, and you had to deal with Chuck, who did returns / swept the warehouse at night, right? It was almost an afterthought. Now, there's teams of individuals at most of these organizations that are digging into the returns issue because it really is so material to the bottom line of their business.
Yeah, and I would add one of the challenges that we see, because we're a secondary market company also, is that what we generally see is our RMA, our return rates on goods that we sell in the secondary are significantly lower than they are in the primary. Our biggest challenge is there's a lot of people that buy from us who are arbitragers. So they'll go out and buy and see what they can sell on eBay or any of those other channels, and then what doesn't sell, they'll return. And Troy, you guys see the same thing.
So retailer return policies are changing. They're recognizing that products that they sell today, especially in the space of digital products, newer models come out in 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months. And retailers had to react because consumers would bring back the old one for the newer model, and it was too easy. So retailer policies are beginning to change. In addition, e-commerce policies are beginning to change. Even if you look at an Amazon, which now charges you $1 if you drop it off at a UPS store versus if you go to Whole Foods, you drop it off. That's the beginning of the change. It's elasticity. How much will a consumer accept it? And that's a challenge to all of you. How much are you willing to accept a free return if you drop it off versus not free if you drop it off at someplace else? So that's going to be consumer behavior measured in the next few years to see what's the elasticity. Does it affect our sales if we charge a consumer for returns? And by the way, many retailers are now charging for return shipments back, right? It's starting to happen. The last NRF reports and our own reporting says about 45 to 50% of e-commerce retailers are now charging something for the return shipment. So that's a beginning of a change. So that was a good question. Thank you. And we could have a lot more conversation about retailer policies, by the way. But I'm also looking, are there any other hands that need to go up? Any questions you want to ask? Otherwise, I've got a couple more for my colleagues here.
I would ask, are there anybody in the audience that deals with returns as part of their responsibility in the company? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
That's about
they're
the
afraid to put up hands, but
that's
they're
about the
shaking their
percentage
heads.
we
Yeah.
typically see, is that it's a small percentage, but it's a very vocal group, but a lot of times they don't have the voice, and Tony's talked about this for years, they don't have the voice in a lot of the companies, and unless it hits the financials of the P&L, it doesn't get the attention that it probably really deserves, because it is fairly impactful.
All right. I think we have a question at the back. Oh, compared to sales. Well, the reported rates have changed over the last few years. And I took over the Reverse Logistics Association in 2016. Return rates were then about 8%. They're now at about 16 to 17% or higher. And again, as Chuck and others have said, a lot of that is e-commerce. Brick and mortar stores, they're great because when you take something back to a Home Depot, for example, you get a chance to interact with somebody and maybe correct the return mistake. But when you're dealing with e-commerce, it's all being shipped to you and you have the pleasure of sending anything back you want to easily. So a lot of things are going on. There was reference by Troy to fraud. Another example, I'm not sure if we classify this as fraud, but apparel has a very high return rate because people bracket. That means you're buying a size bigger, a size smaller, different colors, and you keep what you like, and a lot of heads are shaking. Yes, you keep what you like and you send back the rest. So the rates vary, and by the way, let's be careful. We are talking about retail value, okay? We're not talking about units, we're talking about retail value. So, Chuck, anything to add?
Yeah, I would just say if you go back in the early 90s and you look at predominantly before they had the e-commerce push, return rates at big box companies may run 5 to 6% at the highest. On a blended basis now, if you look at the industry, return rates are 21.6%. And that has jumped since 2022, where it was 15.5. So it's now 21.6, and that it's almost exponential that it's growing every year, and it's the push on the e-commerce side.
At the end of the day, the rate isn't as significant as what do we do with this stuff, right? And that leads to a question, and I'll start with Troy on this one. When you're a big company like Home Depot, the numbers are overwhelming. So do you work and develop this as a core inside Home Depot, or do you use external partners? Because there's both out there. If you talk to that a bit, Troy.
Yeah, so we do a lot of it as core. Like a lot of our return process is done within our Home Depot, organization. When you start looking at what do we do with that freight afterwards, that's when we start branching out to third-party folks, Bargain Hunt, other individuals on the market who will help kind of take that inventory off our hands. Just to get the volume flowing through our sites, we need those folks desperately to take that volume off. Because then just like Chuck and you guys are talking about, the volume that comes back in, our buildings can only store so much. We don't want to get in that storage aspect, so we got to flow it through. We got to have turns in our building. And without those third-party companies out there, those turns would not happen.
Harrison, a little bit from you on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, having assets on both sides of the transaction is generally helpful, right? From my seat, this is my business, right? So I like to think I'm able to add a certain amount of value because I do reverse logistics for a living. On the same side of the coin, having trusted partners, like inside, a Home Depot who understand the nuances of this business are invaluable. And that's where, shameless plug for the Reverse Logistics Association, the education piece that, an organization like the RLA is able to provide is so invaluable, not only for people like myself that this is what I do every day, but for people that are less familiar with the ins and outs or nuances of the reverse business, like you get a kind of a crash course in the relevant topics and vocabulary, quite frankly, of the industry.
And Chuck, you have a good view of the landscape. Do you see internal or external partners becoming predominant? How do you see the landscape shaking out on internal versus external?
I'm not sure when you say internal to a company.
Yes,
versus
to
going
the
external?
retailers. And let's set the stage here. As Chuck and I have discussed before, you go back 25 years, most returns went back to the factory that produced them, went back to the manufacturer that produced them. I was at Phillips. We took everything back. But now, and then maybe 25% the retailers would have to get rid of. So now, Chuck, that's kind of flipped around. And they're using internal or external partners to do this.
Yeah, and it just depends on how's the best way to. There's a lot of companies out there that have built organically return processing, and it's gotten to a point where we're seeing in industry it's very limited capacity, and so they're now trying to say, yeah, I may have to make a CapEx decision to say, do I redesign my returns or do I go outsourcing? Many are going outsourcing because there's a lot of good companies out there that have already developed WMSs and returns management, contract management, that it's easier for them to go to. But because now retailers have become more responsible for a larger portion of the freight, their ability to partner with companies like Bargain Hunt, secondary market, ITAD companies, nonprofits to donate has become more and more critical to make sure, because if you're a major company and you're doing ESG reporting, you know, because a lot of times once it leaves the company, that ESG does not perpetuate itself. It's so you don't know what your secondary market. So you got to have really good, reliable people downstream that are making sure they're taking care of the product. But Harrison, it passes hands multiple times.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's people get into trouble when they dabble in it a little bit, right? If you're not making a dedicated decision whether or not you're going to put the necessary resources to do it effectively yourself, or just outsource it. I mean, organizations like myself, we make our living off of there's value there, right? We're able to step in and extract some of that value. So I don't think it's a question of that there's value to be had in digging in and recognizing the real dollars involved with your reverse logistics process. But it's about being dedicated to doing it the right way.
And I'll just add one thing. I know we have a question up here too. It's just, you think about bringing internal, and a lot of this folks don't think about sustainability and reverse being the same, but there is a big piece of that, right? A lot of that sustainability happens in the reverse space to be sustainable. And so Home Depot does a really great job of making sure, hey, what are we going to do to this product first before we put it anywhere else to kind of grow the sustainability of that? And that's one good reason why I think larger big boxes can kind of bring that in-house to kind of focus on that sustainability side as well.
And there's a question here. Sure. Stand up.
More about, I'm on the service side, warehousing side, and so we're not doing that return. We're seeing more and more fulfillment, so we're getting it back. We don't understand that piece. We just know at some point we'll take the business, and it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense just because of the value of the good, and we know we're willing. Of course, we're going to do it. So from a different level, how does that work? I mean, give me some perspective. I'm just a level away.
All right. Is this non-deliverable freight that's coming back, or is it actually returned from a client?
It's fulfillment. What's going to a personal
Consumer.
Yeah.
Right.
The amount of returns we have forward has to be prepared for it.
Right.
So I was going to set the stage for the question the gentleman's asking is related to, by show of hands, how many of you are involved with 3PLs? Right? A lot of you and some of you at 3PLs have warehouses. And we talked about the volume of returns going up. And he's asking, how do you deal with that if you're a fulfillment forward center? What do you do with that? Now, I personally think you can't do both in the same building generally. There's exceptions, but generally it's a challenge to do both in the same building because you're looking at pictures of the way it comes back. It doesn't look like when it went out. So the other important part, and I'll turn it over to the panelists, is we talked about you're moving stuff that there's nothing wrong with it. So why would you want to move it again if you really ultimately want to see it reused and become part of the circular economy? And that's a term that's out there. If you're not familiar with it, Ellen MacArthur Foundation out of the UK has really spearheaded this concept of don't throw it away, don't recycle it, reuse it, and find a way to reuse it. So how can you as a 3PL and as a warehouse operations do something on that? I think that starts with Chuck.
Yeah, the problem that you outline is really not uncommon. Most people are seeing that. And a lot of times what I see to do is that if you're a fulfillment operation and your expertise isn't in the returns management, there's and I won't do a sales pitch, but there's a bunch of companies out there that can manage that and manage it very effectively for you, either in your building or outside your building. But there's a host of companies because returns has grown so big. Correspondingly, many service providers that have expertise in that area have evolved, and it's just a matter of finding those companies. They have WMSs that can be embedded in yours, or they can work and they can API, EDI, whatever into what you do to manage that effectively. So there's plenty out there.
And about to go to Troy also to comment on that. I do get to do a commercial announcement and tell you that our website, rla.org, has a directory of over 750 companies in the industry that either process returns, recycle, refurbish, resell. So to Chuck's point, if you're not doing it yourself, you can find partners, but you can also consider doing it yourself. And Troy, from your view of how companies deal with this?
Yeah, look, so we had that similar issue, and you look at Home Depot and think, hey, well, why don't, we can do fulfillment. We do it across the country in all these other buildings. So we attempted to do fulfillment out of our reverse maybe 5-6 years ago. We weren't good at it. It's not what we wanted to focus on. It wasn't really the right thing. You're a reverse center focusing on 15 million cartons a year coming through the facility. Now I got to go pick and pack and ship items to customers, and it just wasn't efficient. So we outsourced that, and really we still do that outsource, and it works well because that's not in our business. It's not what we want to focus on. So there's times you've got to find the 700 folks that you have in the catalog to work with you and utilize their tools, because they have much better tools for us than we had in our building. So it worked, but it was very just fragmented as we did it.
And Harrison, from your side, his question's a good one because you've got a lot of 3PLs and warehouse operations, but you normally don't deal with that, or is that an area that Bargain Hunt does engage with?
Yeah, it's timely. Increasingly, we're dealing with that more and more, right? I think what you're getting at is pretty common in the space, right? It's the opacity around the true end-to-end cost of these things, right? And the point of diminishing returns can be met so quickly, right? Again, that's one where, those that are specifically set up to handle that type of product, and that is their business, they just don't exist unless they get really laser focused where, the juice is worth the squeeze, right? That's the value there, right? By the dearth of their own existence, they've identified, where the fat needs to be trimmed.
And I would add, if you're dealing with providers to you that of product, depending on what the policies are and what the disposition, there's software out there that manages that for you too, that can ingest whatever vendor policies exist and manage that process for you in terms of, does it go RTV? Is it on an allowance and has to go to Harrison?
I know just enough to be dangerous, not the operation. I'm going to connect you to the customer with how it's being managed.
Yeah.
Control. If not, like, this can't be right. There's got to be a better way.
No, I think that's exactly right. And like I said, I'm seeing that more and more where, when it's in a when it's in an owned warehouse, like in one of Troy's warehouse, it's real, right? When it's in a 3PL facility, it's a number on a page, right? So it's a different type of pressure. It's an economic pressure, not a physical, tangible. Hey, we need to manage this freight in space. So I think it tends to be skipped over and more underserviced than almost anything else right now that I'm kind of encouraging. We're going through and doing a lot of 3PL cleanups.
Yeah, and many of the companies like ours will consult to help you with that.
So it's important to, again, there's a question. Okay, if you'll come up a little bit so we can catch it. Sorry, it's a little noisier.
I have a question, kind of like a follow-up. So I run a 3PL company. We do a lot of the data processing, sign-in for different companies. Okay. My question is, we are partnered on some projects with companies like Restock. I'm assuming your business is kind of similar to that. Are we seeing that space grow? Because what we find is we try to work with our customers. Some of them just don't want to sell it again because they don't want their brand affected, right?
Yes.
We damage them to throw them up.
Yes.
Some of them we do process, go to secondary sales. Some actually goes back to full sales. Okay. What we are trying to work on is setting up these partnerships for companies, for our customers, for the secondary channel. So how is that space growing? That's one question. Follow-up question is, do you see some of these products going over to developing countries? And is there a channel there, right? From your perspective and from your perspective.
You want to regurgitate
So let's just repeat the question. The question's really about, if you're a 3PL, is this an area of opportunity? Is it growing? And partnerships that you can develop. And I think you wanted Harrison that kind of answer that first. Yeah. Go ahead.
The short answer is it's growing, right? It's growing just organically in volume as people get more and more in tuned into the impact on their bottom line in their business. I think that generally the interest of it is growing. And certainly, you hit on the brand protection element, right? That's certainly a hot button for, certainly the manufacturers, even some of those larger retailers, that have private owned brands. So there's real intensity around that about having really thoughtful, dedicated solutions that aren't just kind of scattershot, sending product into a global liquidations market, right? So I think that it is growing, but it's about having really strategic relationships is where I kind of see that going.
Yeah, I'll second that. I'll second that. It's definitely growing, and in our space, it's growing so much that we have the large companies like you mentioned that we partner with. But we also have other ones we have to reach out to because it's growing. It continues to go, and then we got our own private brands that we have to protect, and then there's a lot of vendors out there who don't want their product sent in these secondary channels. So we're either we're forced to kind of say, hey, they'll let us say you can do this offshores, but just don't do it within the states. So we have to find, to answer your question, yes, there's places offshore we'll send those to, and a lot of those are partners that we kind of work within the states who have kind of set up businesses. So again, third party, we'll work with them, and they'll kind of help us kind of flow that product out in the right manner.
And let's use real life examples about you being 3PLs and what can you do to get involved in this, because it is a profitable industry. It's expensive to move stuff, so end-to-end reviews of the stuff that you ship forward, what happens to it, can show how your company can be profitable in the space. Here's the example, and it's a new term, maybe you haven't heard enough of it yet, but everyone wants to become hyper-local. Imagine mattress in a box, all right, for a moment. They ship them all over the country, they get to somebody's front door, they have 30 days to decide if they like it. And if they don't like it, they send it back. Can you imagine mattress in a box going back to the factory? Not very easily. It's 2,000 pounds of pressure to roll it up. You don't have that in your house. So you just call them up and they send a truck to pick it up. But should it go all the way back to the factory, or should it stay hyper-local and a better, less expensive business decision made? That's what you offer to these partners as 3PLs. You can do something and provide hyper-local solutions. Whether the company decides to donate it, as been mentioned, or resell it, or liquidate it, or create a website for a secondary market that you do the fulfillment for, All of that is possible. So if you're in the 3PL space, that's an opportunity. I think my mic died. It's okay. Anything to add, Chuck, on that?
No, I just, again, but to your basic question, you mentioned the B stocks of the world. Because of what we've seen in the transition over the years of less going to the OEM, more on the retailer, to find outlets, companies like that there's no difficulty in finding them. It's a matter of making sure that you've got the right company for the right item so that you're able to optimize whatever the second shelf sales of that is going to be.
All right, just checking on our time. We got a few more minutes for a few other questions. Daniel, you want to come up again? And this time, Daniel, I think I'll hand you the mic so other...
I guess it's just a follow-up question. It's more, you guys are the experts. Is there value in relabeling, repackaging of returns? You kind of touched on the private label and different things. We do a lot of that, relabeling constantly. Is there a value in the return space?
Yeah, I would tell you what's happening in the reverse industry is people are becoming more aware of costs, and what they're finding is that when they look at their total cost, what does it cost to rebox, what it costs to relabel, they're finding that they're getting much more granular on what product they do. So it's not a blanket. There's usually a cutoff point and says, what is the retail price of this item? And can I cover in my margins in the secondary market the cost of redoing that?
And Harrison, you can speak a little bit to companies that worry about their brand. So go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're exactly right. I couldn't agree more. What types of product you're doing it with, and maybe the next step, like what's the ultimate disposition of that, right? So you're talking about repackaging items. If you're working with a partner like ourselves who's going to take product to a brick and mortar environment, and you're repackaging product into brown boxes or something like that, that's like a zero value add to me, right? It's like actively devaluing the product, and in some instances maybe then taking a like a color package that was damaged in some type of way, right? But yeah, in terms of that, the that gets tied in, as Tony said, to the brand protection piece, right? How you're sometimes it's a requirement, defacing, delabeling, packaging like that. I think it's just as hyper specific about what space you're playing in, right? So there again, if you're an e-commerce organization and you're dealing with a brick and mortar liquidation provider, that sometimes is a really nice harmonious relationship, right? It's a non-competitive sales channel relative to where you're primarily sending your goods. So I think it's kind of a case-by-case thing.
And Troy, one more question for you. Some retailers are developing a secondary marketplace. Nordstrom has rack retail stores and online, and some other retailers. And of course, there's the renewed categories that many on e-commerce. Is that happening at Home Depot, or do you see that happening?
Yeah, we have an online marketplace, right? We do auctions on there, so it is an internal piece, but then we also use third-party suppliers to help us as well. So a little bit of both.
And I would just add to the gentleman's comment about policies. One of the things we are seeing relative to that is we are also seeing policies are changing, and they're doing return terms almost to a fine line level. So that if you're a company that sells a broad range, I may not want my $5 and $10 items back, but I do want my 150 plus items back. So you're starting to see a lot more granular in the policies to have different dispositions based on price point.
Any other questions? Again, this is a huge industry, folks. I hope you got the idea of how big it is. The numbers are big. The opportunities are there. Secondary marketplaces exist. Policies are changing, but returns will continue to grow. There is the importance, those of you who want to consider doing something with the return goods, recognize that a lot of our products now are digital and they contain private information. You may have loaded your credit card up on a product for whatever reason, including your car these days. And there are standards to be aware of if you're getting into the space. And I think Troy and the others on the panel would also talk the same way about hazmat materials and so on. but in particular, digital products. Even my LG refrigerator at home tracks what's inside of it, and when I take it out, and it's telling somebody, including my phone. So that kind of stuff is going on. You have to be very careful that any products you decide to do something with, that you have a way to wipe the data completely out. And there are DoD, Department of Defense standards that are adhered to. It's called the R2 standard. That's one of our alliance partners. So if you visit our website, you'll see a lot of information about this. But Troy, from your side, are there products that you want to urge some other cautions about?
Yeah, we mostly deal with the haz waste issues, that stuff being returned. You know, you look at the shift of away from gasoline items to battery powered items. That's our biggest kind of concern in our world, is that if we're not forwarding this off to other buyers out there and making sure none of these batteries and stuff find their way into the trash, because some things do, you know, end result, some things do get thrown away. But there's the batteries now, if you've gone to any of these shows, are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. I went to one last year, and I think the battery, basically the size of your pinky, it powers a power tool. And so the challenge is making sure those don't find a way in the waste stream, because again, there's responsibilities that we have to make sure that those aren't going that route. And then if so, also find buyers for those, because again, we don't want to, you know, send them back to 3 or another company, but there's also those buyers for those as well, believe it or not, who wants those items.
Yeah, and I would say staying on top of regulatory changes is critical. You know, lithium ion is problematic, but as we were talking early about Cody, there are things there that are based on percent of alcohol that are, you know, nail polish, hair color is considered hazmat. So when you're managing all this, you have to understand all the hazmat ID codes, and it can be a very, very complicated process.
Yeah, and I think even, you know, come beyond, you know, the things that you would traditionally think, you know, hazmat, things like that are difficult. You know, Tony brought up mattresses as an example a little bit ago. State to state, how that's regulated is really fine in terms of the resale requirements on that, the packaging that's involved, exactly what state you can resell an item like that in a, you know, that came from like a return environment. So it's not just, you know, the things that you normally think of in terms of, you know, the regular regulations. You know, there's some kind of odd nuances that you wouldn't ordinarily think of.
And if I can start to wrap up with a little more plug for the RLA, we're responsible to help you know what some of those regulations are. It should be on our site when it applies and so on. But I do want to reemphasize, there's 3 legs of the stool in the returns industry. One is, can we do anything to reduce them, prevent them, etc.? And not enough is being done there, and you're part of a 3PL world, so it's not in your world. The second is, what do you do with the stuff? That's where you all belong. What can you help someone do with that returned stuff? And you've heard some very good examples of what they can do with it. And you all need to remember that term, hyper-local. It's coming, and it's becoming big, and you are all part of that. So what can you do with the stuff? And then the third aspect is, how much can you get for that stuff? That's the most important financial measure, of course, is liquidation, resale. And I'm proud of having 3 panelists, 3 thought leaders who are all helping their companies make a difference and not lose as much money. I hesitate, and I know Troy and sometimes Harrison could talk about making money in that. From the manufacturer's world, it's always a loss, but both of you at least, and Chuck, you have experience, companies are able to indicate they're making a profit in this space now. And that's part of the secret sauce. I'm not going to ask any of them to talk about it, but you as a 3PL can go to a company and teach them how to make money in the returns business. Again, I have a hard time saying that out loud from the manufacturer's side, but were there any last questions by anybody? I know we're between you and lunch, and I can hear it going on over there, so I don't want to keep you all too long. We really appreciate CSCMP focusing on this area a little bit. We'll get a little more next year. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of education in this space yet, not a lot of college degrees. So this is how we learn. We come to you, we try to bring you the best information, the best knowledge, And we really appreciate you listening. Give a round of applause for our speakers today, and thank you very much for listening.